Crimea is still under Russian control. The troops are still there. The defenses are still operating. On the surface, nothing appears dramatically different. Then one detail started to stand out. Not a new offensive, not a major breakthrough, not the loss of territory, the movement of senior commanders, the people responsible for planning operations and understanding the broader picture of the war. That should concern anyone paying attention. Because throughout military history, commanders rarely move first when they believe a position is becoming safer. They move when they believe the opposite. Today, roughly 50,000 Russian troops remain stationed across Crimea. They stay. The generals don't. And in war, the people who move first are often the people who know the most. That's what makes this important. Crimea has not fallen. The troops are still holding their positions. The peninsula remains heavily defended. But heavily defended doesn't always mean secure. And that raises an important question. What do the people with the clearest view of the battlefield believe is coming next? Because if they're moving before everyone else, they may be reacting to problems that are only beginning to emerge. Problems that could become much harder to solve if they're ignored for too long. And if that's true, then the most important story in Crimea may not be what is happening today. It may be what the generals believe is coming next. For years, Crimea was supposed to be the place nobody wanted to leave. Not because it was comfortable, because it was important. The peninsula sat at the center of Russia's military presence in the Black Sea. It was heavily defended, heavily supplied, and treated as one of the most valuable positions under Moscow's control. Which is exactly why the recent movement of senior commanders stands out. This is not some isolated outpost. This is Crimea. And when experienced officers begin spending less time in a place like Crimea and more time elsewhere, it deserves attention. Because military commanders rarely move first when they believe the situation is becoming easier. They move when they believe something is changing. The obvious question is why? What are they seeing that makes Crimea look different from the way it looked a year ago? This is not the first sign that something may be changing. Over the past few years, some of the Black Sea Fleet's most valuable assets have gradually moved away from Sevastopol. What once operated from Crimea increasingly operates somewhere else. The fleet was one of the first signs. It may not be the last. And that changes how recent events should be viewed. Buildings don't make decisions. Commanders do. The troops remain. The defenses remain. Crimea remains under Russian control. Yet, some of the people with the clearest view of the battlefield appear to be positioning themselves somewhere else. Not because Crimea has already fallen, but because they may believe the Crimea of tomorrow will be different from the Crimea of today. And if they're right, then the people staying behind may be facing a future that looks very different from the present. And that raises a question that becomes harder to ignore. What are the generals seeing that 50,000 troops still on the peninsula cannot afford to miss? While attention has focused on the movement of senior commanders, daily operations across Crimea have continued almost unchanged. Aircraft still take off from military airfields across the peninsula. Radar stations still scan the skies over the Black Sea. Supply convoys still move between bases. Naval facilities still support military operations. And every morning, thousands of soldiers still report for duty. From a distance, Crimea still looks like a functioning military fortress. That is exactly why the situation is so easy to misunderstand. Because while command personnel have increasingly shifted their activities elsewhere, the forces responsible for defending Crimea have remained exactly where they are. The people leaving and the people staying are tied to Crimea in very different ways. A commander can relocate to another headquarters. A planning staff can operate from another city, but an air defense battery cannot relocate overnight. A fuel depot cannot relocate overnight. A runway cannot relocate overnight. Neither can the thousands of troops assigned to protect them. And that is why the number matters. roughly 50,000 Russian personnel remain spread across airfields, ports, command centers, ammunition sites, and defensive positions throughout the peninsula. The generals can leave Crimea. The soldiers guarding its infrastructure cannot. A headquarters can relocate. A runway cannot. A command post can move. An entire defensive position cannot. And in war, distinctions like that often matter more than anyone realizes at the time. The troops remain. The airfields remain. The bases remain. The mission remains. Because this story is no longer about the people leaving. It's about the people staying behind. And if some of the people planning for the future are beginning to look elsewhere, then the question is no longer who is leaving Crimea. The question is, what happens if the people leaving turn out to be right? And that's where the real story begins. The first real warning sign did not come from troop numbers. It came from Sevastopol. For years, Sevastopol served as the center of Russian military power in Crimea. The Black Sea Fleet operated from its ports. Command structures operated from its headquarters. Military planners treated it as one of the most secure operational zones in the region. Then, the pattern began to change. As strikes increasingly reached military facilities in and around Sevastopol, planners were forced to confront a reality they had long tried to avoid. Crimea was no longer insulated from direct operational pressure. Protection was no longer sufficient on its own. At that point, planning shifted, not toward expansion, but toward survival of structure. Relocation became necessary. Dispersal became routine. Redundancy became a requirement rather than a precaution. Over time, naval assets were no longer concentrated in Sevastopol as a single operational hub, but distributed across multiple supporting locations. Command functions followed the same pattern. Critical systems that once operated from a centralized point were gradually fragmented across the peninsula. None of these changes happened because Crimea had been lost. They happened because concentration was no longer considered safe, and that created a structural shift in how the system operated. Sevastopol was no longer functioning as a single command center. It had become a distributed operational environment under pressure. What had once been centralized coordination became layered and fragmented. What had once been unified control now required multiple overlapping systems working in parallel. Every adjustment solved an immediate problem, but every adjustment also introduced new complexity. The map did not change. Crimea remained under Russian control. The bases remained active. The troops remained in position. But the way the system behaved had changed. This is the point many overlook. Military strength is not only about assets. It is about coherence. And coherence begins to degrade when structure is forced into constant adjustment. The fortress still stands, but it is no longer operating as a unified system in the same way. It is increasingly reacting to pressure instead of shaping conditions. And that was the first clear signal. A shift had begun inside Sevastopol that would not remain confined to one location. It would raise a larger question. What happens when that pressure extends beyond a single node and begins affecting the entire system? Sevastopol revealed the first warning sign. Kerch revealed another. For years, one of Crimea's greatest advantages was not simply its defenses. It was its redundancy. If one facility faced problems, another could absorb part of the burden. If one route became more difficult, resources could be redirected elsewhere. Options existed. That was part of what made Crimea so valuable. But as military assets became increasingly dispersed across the peninsula, another reality began to emerge. The connections linking those assets became more important than ever before. Ships could be moved. Equipment could be moved. Command functions could be moved. But once they moved, they became more dependent on the routes, facilities, and transport links connecting the system together. And few connections became more important than Kerch. As military functions were redistributed across Crimea, more of the system increasingly depended on a smaller number of critical links. Crimea may look like a fortress on a map. In reality, It is a peninsula. Everything entering the peninsula must pass through a limited number of routes, facilities, and transport corridors. The more military functions were redistributed, the more those connections mattered. And the more those connections mattered, the harder they became to replace. That is where the next layer of pressure appeared. A problem in one location could increasingly affect several others. A disruption in one part of the network could create consequences across the system. Not because the fortress had suddenly become weaker, but because replacing critical connections had become more difficult. The troops remained. The bases remained. The defenses remained. But maintaining all of them required a growing web of coordination, logistics, and support. The system kept working, but every new workaround made it more dependent on the next one. Sevastopol showed that assets could be moved. Kerch revealed the cost of moving them. And that raises a much bigger question. What happens when Ukraine no longer needs to break the fortress at all? It is happening in the way the system behaves under pressure. In recent strikes, targeting southern logistics routes feeding into Crimea, particularly rail-linked corridors connected to the broader Kerch supply chain, Ukrainian forces have increasingly focused on key nodes that keep movement across the peninsula functioning. These points do not need to be destroyed completely to matter. They only need to be disrupted. Because in a system already relying on fewer stable connections, disruption does not stay contained. It moves through timing, through coordination, through dependency. In one recent instance, a rail convoy approaching a transfer junction was temporarily held due to congestion further along the corridor, forcing immediate adjustment of downstream scheduling before movement could continue. A single delay like this does not stop the system, but it forces the system to reorganize itself in real time. This is the critical shift. It is no longer about isolated disruption events. It is about how quickly the system must adapt every time one occurs. Same structure, different behavior under pressure. And once that difference appears, it does not disappear. The system is still functioning, but it is no longer operating in a stable rhythm. Each adjustment now carries forward into the next. Each correction becomes part of the next constraint. And over time, stability is no longer something the system returns to. It is something it continuously recalibrates around. Ukraine does not need to physically enter Crimea to influence this dynamic. It only needs to continue applying pressure to the routes that sustain movement. Because once coordination becomes harder than defense, the nature of the conflict changes completely. At that point, Crimea is no longer defended as a fortress. It is a system operating under persistent structural strain, where every new adjustment reduces the space for the next one. By this stage, the pattern inside Crimea is no longer theoretical. It is operational. In several logistics corridors feeding into the broader Kerch-linked supply system, coordination has begun to show visible strain as small disruptions ripple through connected routes. In one instance, a rail convoy approaching a key transfer point was held for an extended period due to congestion further along the corridor, forcing a rescheduling of movement across multiple dependent units. This is no longer isolated friction. It is a developing operational condition. Movements that were once continuous now pause at key transfer points before proceeding. Some transfers no longer follow their intended timing. Others are redirected to avoid pressure building elsewhere in the network. Each adjustment solves an immediate problem, but it also reshapes the conditions for the next movement. The infrastructure is unchanged, but the outcomes it produces under pressure are no longer the same. Same system, different results under identical pressure. At certain junctions along the rail corridors feeding toward the Kerch-linked network, capacity limits are being reached more frequently, forcing temporary holds and redistribution of flow across alternate routes. A single delayed convoy now affects multiple downstream units, waiting for synchronized execution. When movement is adjusted to avoid disruption, pressure is shifted rather than removed. When coordination increases, execution becomes slower and more dependent on upstream timing. And no single adjustment restores the previous rhythm. It only creates a new one. And this is the critical shift. Stability is no longer something the system returns to. It is something the system continuously rebuilds under constraint. By this point, the system inside Crimea is already operating under visible strain. Adjustments have been made across logistics routes. Dependencies on key corridors have increased, and coordination between sectors now requires more time and precision than before. In several rail-linked supply corridors feeding toward the Kerch connected network, convoy movements are no longer aligning cleanly with their planned transfer windows. In one specific instance, a scheduled rail convoy was held at a transfer junction longer than planned due to upstream congestion, forcing an immediate adjustment to multiple downstream movement schedules. This is no longer isolated disruption. It is a pattern beginning to define operational behavior. Same system, no longer the same outcome under identical pressure. What was once an occasional adjustment has become a recurring requirement. What was once handled quietly now requires structured coordination before execution. Movements are still taking place, but they no longer follow a predictable rhythm under stress. And this is no longer just a turning point. It is a shift in operating reality. Not because the system has stopped functioning, but because it is no longer producing the same results under the same conditions. This is where strain stops being temporary and becomes structural. At that point, the system is no longer absorbing pressure. It is operating inside it as a permanent constraint. And according to some assessments, that transition may already be underway. By now, the situation inside Crimea is no longer defined by isolated incidents. It is defined by accumulated pressure. What began as adjustments to individual disruptions has evolved into a broader pattern that military planners can no longer ignore. In several sectors of the logistics network, movement is no longer as fluid as it once was. Rail corridors take longer to clear. Supply transfers require additional coordination before execution, and small delays now begin to appear across multiple connected routes at the same time. For those with access to the full operational picture, the concern is no longer about single failures. It is about how many parts of the system can still function at full efficiency simultaneously, and that number is no longer stable, not because of a single event, but because of direction. The generals are not reacting to one crisis. They are reacting to a pattern forming in real time, a pattern where every adjustment produces diminishing returns, where every correction introduces new friction, and where the system becomes harder to keep aligned with each passing cycle. At a certain point, this is no longer a question of isolated pressure points. It becomes a question of trajectory, and that trajectory is increasingly difficult to reverse. This is what separates observation from warning. The system is still functioning, but it is no longer functioning on stable ground. It is operating inside a structure where every new solution changes the conditions it was meant to fix. And that is what they see coming. Not collapse. Not a single breaking point, but a direction that keeps tightening with every adjustment made. If you want to see how this kind of pressure reshapes modern warfare, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because in the next analysis, we will break down what this means for the wider Black Sea balance, and why Crimea may no longer be just a regional fortress, but a system under permanent strategic strain.